Hello friends, welcome to Mr. Snail's Wild Ride. I am Mr. Snayl, and the wild ride is my life so far. Carl Jung coined the term synchronicity in the 1950s as a way of referring to events that occur simultaneously and appear to have a significant relationship, but actually have no causal connection at all. Another way people describe this is to say that the universe is trying to tell you something. Well, lately the universe has been screaming at me, most recently through author Steven Pressfield, by way of all people, YouTuber Hart. Have you ever had that experience where you learn a new word or a person's name and then you feel like you hear it all the time for a while? Well, I've had that experience recently, except I learned a new application for a word. Recently I was discussing with my wife this recurring problem that I've had for a long time, where after I've been working on something for a while, whatever it is, something I enjoy or something I don't like, I start to build up this resistance to working on it. I had just sort of come to this realization myself, even though I'd had this experience for a long time, and I had just sort of chalked it up to my own depression. So she recommended that I discuss it with my hypnotherapist, with whom I had an appointment in just a couple of days. I did, so we focused on it in that session and began the long road of trying to resolve this lifelong problem that I've had. When I left, I checked my Twitter feed before I got on the highway, and I'd received a new tweet from Hart, who's the host of My Drunk Kitchen, among other things, and she also does this walking book club, which is a partnership she has with Audible. And she had just announced that she had posted a new video about a new and improved version of the walking book club, so I figured I would check it out on my phone. And I watched the video and eventually got to a part that melted my brain.
The book I've selected this time is The War of Art by Steven Pressfield. A friend of mine is struggling with a really hard life transition right now. I think that reading a book about getting past resistance.
There I was, sitting in my car, screaming, "I get it! I get it!" Since my drive home is like an hour and 20 minutes, and the audiobook is only 3 hours long, I logged on my phone, downloaded it to my phone, and started listening. By way of disclaimer, I was clearly primed and predisposed to hear what this book had to say to me in my life right now. So, here's the review part.
Yes!
Now, I've read a few self-help books in my time, and I tend to be pretty skeptical of them. They lean toward being kind of new agey, they have these magical messages, but Steven Pressfield's The War of Art had some pretty significant differences. It was very short. The print version has fewer than 200 pages. The writing was very clear. It gets right to the point. It's almost blunt, really. So in the first section, Pressfield basically defines his terms. What is resistance? The second part of the book is my favorite because Pressfield delivers the answers. How do you combat resistance? Like this. It's not this ephemeral, touchy-feely conceptual stuff. It's concrete. It's not easy. It's a long list of stuff you have to do, but it's useful. There's several items. For example, he'll say, be patient. He'll explain it briefly, and then he'll give an example, and he does that for each of the line items. He'll say, seek order. This is what I mean, and then here's an example of how you would do that. Fantastic. For me, the biggest takeaway from this book is this idea that Pressfield defines about the difference between the amateur and the pro. For the amateur, art is an avocation, it's a hobby. But for the pro, art is their vocation. It's their main occupation, their life focus. So for an amateur, their art is precious. They're over-invested in its success, and they're terrified of its future, and they take it so seriously that it paralyzes them. And that's exactly where I was with music. Pros just keep plugging away. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. They're in it for the long haul. Their accomplishment is measured in the accrual of inches, steady and over time. Pros don't get validation from the work. They get validation from working, from the self. I didn't really realize is that nearly everyone suffers from the same thing that I do. No matter how many compliments you receive, the thing you remember is that one criticism. The difference between a lot of people and me is that degree that the criticism immobilizes you. I have to remember that I am not my work. Now, I have to confess that I was not a big fan of the third part of the book. To me, it read like he was kind of all over the place. In the very first section, he gives the reader permission to interpret terms like muses and angels in whatever way you're comfortable with. But so much of the language that he uses throughout the third part of the book, it's so heavily couched in traditions and lore that are associated with those terms that it felt to me like you'd have to rewrite a lot of that part of the book in order to interpret it any other way. Now, I will admit right up front that I'm biased. I very much fit Pressfield's definition of the ego. I'm very pragmatic and very practical and defined. I believe that this world has physical limitations and that it's all that we will know. But that's me. I'm not a particularly spiritual person. And so bearing that in mind, most of part 3 read kind of like latter-day Richard Bach to me. It was too goopy. But that said, there were occasional interesting sections, especially the one on fear. That part on fear reminded me of the first time that I read Douglas Copeland's Generation X, in a good way. So, as if you couldn't tell already, this book really spoke to me on a personal level. It was written to support any sort of creative endeavor, painting or starting a new business or what have you. But the author is a writer, and so much of the content was filtered through that point of view. And that flavorant really spoke to me, because although I have dreaded admitting it to anyone, that is currently what I am pursuing myself, becoming a writer. That aside, I am interested in your stories, how you deal with and experience resistance in your lives, creatively and otherwise. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for tubing in. We'll see you next week. It's short, it's clear, and that's my review. Good night. This had some significant... Although it was written to apply to most any creative endeavor, however you might interpret that. Art, any other guy's name, really. Joe, Stan. It's not some touchy-feely ephemeral thing. It's not easy. Someone's at the door. Perhaps they have the answers.